All righty. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much to everyone who is joining us live for today's Lunch and Learn, Benefits and Burdens, Exploring the Role of Community Benefits in Wind Energy Development. And thank you to everyone who is watching this recording on YouTube. When local residents want to ensure that their communities benefit from private development, whether that's a real estate development or a clean energy development or any kind of development, they often turn to something called community benefits agreements, or CBAs. These legal agreements detail the benefits that a developer agrees to fund or to furnish in exchange for community support of a project. And the benefits can come in lots of different forms. They can be developed through diverse processes, and they can have varying impacts on key outcomes like the project's success and on equity. There is a ton to know about CBAs, and the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL, is engaged in ongoing research on community benefit agreements, the related funds, voluntary mechanisms that developers can use to deliver financial and other benefits to impacted communities. We are so lucky to be joined by experts from NREL today. Suzanne MacDonald is a senior researcher and project leader, and Matilda Kreider is a wind energy researcher. They're going to walk us through the ins and outs of community benefits agreements and share examples of investments being used in offshore and land-based wind energy development, including some examples from Maine. I can't wait. We are going to learn so much today. My name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Senior Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to building a just, thriving future for all by acting on the climate crisis, protecting the environment, and safeguarding our democracy. MCA does that by bringing people and organizations together to educate, inspire, and advocate. And MCV by advocating for equitable policies, holding elected officials accountable, and winning elections. Since 2020, this weekly online Lunch and Learn series has helped us advance all of those goals, creating a shared space to explore our environmental and social history, our policy priorities, climate action movement, and more. Thank you all for being a part of it. I often say that this is my favorite part of the week every week, and that is in large part thanks to all of you. A few notes before we dive in. We will hear from our speakers first and then tackle all of your questions, or as many as possible, in the Q&A at the end. You don't have to wait, though. You can send questions to me or to Maggie Summers through the chat whenever they occur to you. We will put them all together, synthesize them, ask as many as possible, and keep track of the ones that we need to follow up on if we don't get to them. If you have any technical difficulties today, you can message Maggie. She is your best bet and she'll help you out. This event is being recorded, and the video will be posted on our website and our YouTube channel later this afternoon. You'll also get a follow-up email with a link to the recording, as well as a whole bunch of resources that we hear about or will help you continue your learning and take action after the program. Thank you all for joining us. And Suzanne, I think I am turning it over to you to kick things off.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Kathleen. I think Matilda's going to pull up some slides real quick. But good afternoon, everybody. Suzanne MacDonald, as Kathleen said, I'm a senior researcher and project leader at the National Renewable Energy Lab. I explain my role by basically saying that I feel like I'm working at NREL to help ensure that the resources created by the U.S. Department of Energy and its national lab system are as relevant and helpful to communities and folks working on the clean energy transition on the ground as possible. And so my work really cuts across different technologies at NREL and DOE, and I think a lot and work a lot with folks on issues around program design and capacity building initiatives, but a subset of my work is focused on the wind sector, and that's what we'll be focusing on here today. We can go to the next slide. If you're not familiar with NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, we are part of the national lab system serving the U.S. Department of Energy, and we're the only lab with a sole focus of supporting DOE to understand clean energy opportunities and challenges across the U.S. We are a relatively good sized lab. We're going from the small medium bucket into the sort of the larger side. We've been growing rapidly in the last few years and have staff approaching 4,000. We are known for world-class expertise. You have probably heard NREL quoted or read a report. We have a lot of really smart technical folks and engineers on our team, but we are excited that I think as NREL increasingly and DOE understands the fact that all of this technology has implications for people. And so Matilda and myself are part of a rapidly growing set of the lab, a section of the lab focused on stakeholder engagement, social sciences, and really understanding the people side of the clean energy transition. We work in partnership to really help explore and drive the clean energy transition. We are funded primarily by the US federal government. About 60% of our funding comes from DOE, but we do work with other federal agencies and academia and a lot of industry partnerships as well. And this is our main campus here. I call it the mothership in Golden, Colorado. We also have a wind technology center in Arvada outside of Boulder, offices in Washington, D.C. and Fairbanks, Alaska, and a rapidly growing contingent of remote workers based in Maine. I think there are 7 or 8 of us, and I will admit, I also live on the coast of Maine, which has really been a huge inspiration for this piece of work. So did just want to make a brief introduction before I hand it over to Matilda about this work and why it's so nice to talk to a group of folks from Maine. If you don't know, I spent 13 years working with communities on the coast of Maine on a host of different issues, including clean energy and land-based and offshore wind. And so it's nice to see so many familiar names in the participant list. And I know that many of you have deep understanding of this topic and have maybe been a part of some of these agreements yourselves. So really welcome your questions and comments as we move forward. But I've been working with communities on wind-related issues since 2009. And I think since the beginning, there's been a lot of questions about both impacts and potential benefits. We really looked at that time over to Europe to understand how the industry was establishing different benefit funds and benefit mechanisms, and tried to inform some of the efforts that were happening here in Maine and actually more broadly in New England. With support of the US Department of Energy, I was able to run a community of practice of sorts for several years between islands off the coast of New England that were proximate to offshore wind development. So that included Monhegan Island here in Maine, Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, and Block Island to our south. And this topic was something that they were all seeking to learn from each other on. And we had the chance to publish some research on that experience back in 2015. By publishing that research, it's meant that I've heard from folks all across the US in the years since, really trying to understand both strategies for engaging communities on offshore wind, but specifically around this concept of benefits. And so when I came to NREL about 18 months or so ago, I was really excited to have the chance to work with a great team of researchers, really with Matilda leading it up, to really dig into this topic and to create a set of nationally accessible resources around community benefits, not just in what's happening in New England, but across the country in both land-based and offshore sectors. And we are sort of 1 year into a 5-year work plan on this topic. And today we're really looking forward to sharing with you what we've learned thus far. And we'll do our best to highlight some Maine specific examples as we go through that we thought might be of interest to you all. So Matilda, I will hand it over to you for the meat of all of this.
Thanks, Suzanne. So we'll start off with just a definition of community benefits. And this is just a definition, not the definition. There are many different understandings of what community benefits are. These sometimes vary from region to region or even from person to person within a community. So we're really just kind of setting the stage here so that we all have the same language for this presentation, but it's by no means the only or correct definition. At NREL, we define community benefits as an agreement, fund, or other mechanism voluntarily used by a developer to provide additional financial or non-financial benefits to a community. The reason that I say voluntary is that there are currently few requirements for community benefits in the US. These benefits are typically given entirely by the choice of a developer, although Maine is an exception to that, and Suzanne will get into that a little bit later. You may have heard about new rules or regulations related to community benefits, such as the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management's leasing credits for community benefits, but most of the ones we're beginning to see are still not mandating them, but rather encouraging them. I also want to note that it's not always a wind energy developer that's providing the benefits. It could be a port developer, a transmission infrastructure developer, a government entity, or another stakeholder. But one of the key facets of community benefits that differentiate them from other types of benefits from energy development is that they're intended to benefit the whole or majority of the community. This differs from some other benefits like landowner payments for landowners who host wind turbines on their property, or project labor agreements that benefits workers working on a project. Community benefits are typically on the local level, intended to benefit the local community that's being most impacted by project infrastructure. But in some cases, benefits may be distributed on the regional or state level, such as a regional fisheries compensation fund. And then finally, going back to the word additional, community benefits are given in addition to required economic benefits, such as property and sales taxes. There is some gray area about whether tax agreements like a payment in lieu of taxes or pilot agreement could be considered community benefits, but typically we try to keep these separate just for clarity. And so we consider community benefits to be separate from taxation. So community benefits can come in a wide variety of forms, but our team has been thinking about 4 general forms or structures that we're commonly seeing. The first is what most people probably think of when they hear community benefits, which is a community benefit agreement or CBA. This is an agreement between developers and local governments, tribal governments, or community organizations that may or may not be a formal legally binding agreement. It can also have different names like a host community agreement or a tribal benefit agreement as another recent one we've seen. The second is a community benefit fund in which a developer establishes a fund that distributes grants or scholarships that the community may apply for, or they may be given out over time. This may be administered by the developer, by a local organization, by the local government. There can be a lot of variation in what it's called, who can receive funds, and some other variations that we'll talk about on the next slide. Then there's direct investment in local priorities or programs, which usually takes the form of a developer donating money or other resources to a community organization or cause. And then finally, there are non-financial benefits, which is a broad bucket that can contain anything from expanding internet access across a community to establishing workforce training programs to building a new school playground. We generally think of this as being things that are separate from any mitigation measures that might be required in relation to the project. So things like monitoring wildlife impacts would not be included in this bucket. And it's worth noting that these forms can and often do interact with each other. Some benefits may fall between them or be a mixture of them, making it a bit unclear how to categorize them. For example, a developer and community might agree to a CBA, and that CBA might include a community benefit fund or non-financial benefits. But our reason for pointing out these forms is so that there's more of a common language about what forms community benefits can take, although there are a lot of details that fall between the cracks. And those are some of the variations that we're going to talk about now. So with financial benefits, there can be variation in the amount of money provided to the community, as well as the method or mechanism for distributing funds. For example, funds may be given directly to a local government or be placed in a fund that the community decides to distribute grants from over time. With non-financial benefits, the main variation would be the purpose or target of the benefit. For example, it could be an environmental cause or an educational cause. And then there are some variations that are seen across all types of benefits, such as variations in who makes decisions about the benefits, like the developer, the local government, or a committee of community members. There's also variations in the timeline for distributing benefits. Funds may be distributed one time, like when the project's being built, or annually over the lifetime of the project. And then finally, variation in who or what receives the benefit. For example, scholarships or a new school facility might be more oriented towards students and children in the community. Other benefits may be more broadly across all ages in the population. And there isn't a right or wrong way to approach community benefits. Any of these different variations allow for customization that could make benefits more in step with what communities want. Some things will work better for some types of communities depending on their history and internal dynamics. For example, a community with a strong culture of collaborative planning and decision-making might be unhappy with the developer making all the decisions and presenting an agreement to the community without their input. We've also heard from some local leaders with community benefit funds that they really like being able to distribute funds annually over time so they can evaluate community needs annually. So you might be wondering why community benefits are worth considering or why you're hearing about them so much right now. Community benefits are an emerging practice in the US. It has not been standard part of wind development to provide community benefits in the way that other things like landowner payments and tax agreements have been. But in many parts of Europe, there is a long history of providing community benefit agreements and funds attached to offshore and land-based wind projects. And there's been a great deal of social science and economic research done on the topic in Europe that we can learn from. But one of the main reasons this is a popular topic in the US right now is that we're seeing community benefits play a more significant role in offshore wind than they have in land-based wind or other energy sectors like fossil fuels or solar. We're also seeing connections made between community benefits and energy justice or equity, with one view being that community benefits are a way to ensure wind development is equitable, and another view being that it could reinforce inequities in some situations. This is something we'll talk about in greater depth later in this webinar or this presentation. For these reasons and many others, there's been increased interest in this topic from federal, state, local, and tribal governments. Some governments are even beginning to incentivize developers to provide community benefits. For example, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management included a bidding credit for developers who had CBAs in place in its California lease auction, and the state of New York offers a streamlined siting process to developers with host community agreements in place. And I'm going to hand it over to Suzanne to talk about some of Maine's laws and requirements related to community benefits.
Thanks, Matilda. So folks may be familiar, have some degree of familiarity with the Maine Wind Energy Act. It's been around since 2003, initially created to guide land-based development in the state of Maine, and over time was expanded to include provisions around offshore wind. I have to be honest, I don't consider myself an expert on this, but I think and maybe folks at MCV are, or others on the call, but what is interesting is that I do think Maine stands out as being one of those states that actually for quite some time now has been providing guidance around this concept of benefits. So within the Maine Wind Energy Act, it states that the development of Maine wind energy resources should be undertaken in a manner that ensures significant tangible benefits to the people of the state, including but not limited to residents of communities that host wind energy facilities. So that's something that I was interested to learn about years ago, and we've been sharing sort of as a part of the inspiration for this work. We go to the next slide, Matilda. So specifically, something that caught our attention early on is the requirement of a benefits package valued at no less than $4,000 per turbine per year per turbine, averaged over a 20-year period. This is something that was created quite some time ago. That provision probably is about 15 years old, I believe. There are some exemptions in there so that not every project is required to make those payments. We've listed some of those exemptions here. And also host communities have the opportunity through the Wind Energy Act to request the state's assistance with maximizing some of the economic benefits from the community benefit payments. Go to the next slide. One of the things, as you heard from Matilda, that we've grappled with in all of this is that people use different language to describe all of this. Community benefits means different things to different people. And one of the things that's kind of nice about the Maine Wind Energy Act is that it takes the time to describe all of these terms in detail. So we have this concept of tangible benefits. This is all summarized, from statute that's many pages long, and so if you're interested in learning more, you can Google that up, or we can drop a link in the chat. But the idea of tangible benefits, community benefit agreements are defined, with community benefit packages being the aggregate of all of those benefits. There has definitely been a part of the Energy Act around expedited permitting areas, and sort of how that connects to these concepts of benefits as well. Next slide, Matilda. And so over time, there has also been these offshore wind provisions that have been incorporated into the Wind Energy Act. This started with some definition around the need for benefits around the demonstration project in Maine state waters, and has extended into the solicitation process from the Maine Public Utilities Commission to procure offshore wind, is essentially requiring that it must give priority to projects that provide community benefits, and have some definition of that in the statute as well. Next slide, Matilda.
All right.
I'll hand this one back to you.
Thank you. So we're just going to go over now some of the national trends and what we're seeing for land-based wind projects, and then we'll talk about offshore wind separately. But we're eventually going to look at about 1,100 utility scale wind projects in the country. But so far we've looked at about 700 and have found around 230 that had some form of community benefit. And with land-based wind, by far the most common form of benefit has been contributions to local organizations and causes. We found a wide variety of recipients, but some of the most common have been volunteer fire departments, food banks, and school programs. Establishment of a community fund has also been somewhat common, and sometimes these funds are earmarked for specific causes like environmental conservation, business development, scholarships, or civic causes. But it's pretty uncommon to see an actual legally binding community benefit agreement involving direct payments to the local government and land-based wind. The exception has been for projects in New York and Maine, since they have laws incentivizing developers to form those agreements, or in some cases requiring it. And we have seen that some developers are offering community benefits much more frequently than others, suggesting it may be part of some developers' standard or typical approach to development, and for other developers, it's not really part of their approach. And one thing to note with land-based wind is that it is a lot more difficult to find publicly available documentation of community benefits, since a lot of these projects have been around for 20 years or more, so there's less information online. Offshore wind is a lot easier to track for that reason, especially as it's happening right now. And I'm going to hand it back to Suzanne to talk about some of the main examples that we have found.
Yeah, so one of the things that's pretty cool about this is that I believe through the DEP that these commitments are tracked. And so we were able to get a list of where some of these benefit agreements have been developed and benefit payments. And so just wanted to quickly highlight some of these. I think folks know that Maine leads with the installed wind capacity for land-based wind in the region. And so we're fortunate to have some good examples for us to look at in this research. So just after the requirement of the per turbine payments was created, we have Bingham Wind in Somerset and Piscataquis County, 2016, that project going into operation, basically a series of annual payments being made to invest in economic development and some other municipal activities. Bull Hill Wind in 2012 down in Hancock County, a series of annual payments to the county and to towns, as well as some one-time and annual payments to the Downey Salmon Federation. And then before this requirement came into place around the per turbine payments, Record Hill Wind did come online and actually has an interesting program where they're actually helping to subsidize the electricity bills for residents of the town through that project. Next slide. More recently, this is definitely a continuing trend here that we're seeing in terms of these investments. So Weaver Wind coming online between Hancock and Washington counties, $1.87 million community benefit agreement that breaks down as listed on the slide. And then we've definitely seen some coverage around a project that's under construction in Washington County called Down East Wind, where there's some pretty significant payments going to the county and to the host community there, as well as a community grant program that's supporting a number of efforts even before the project has gone into operation. So just wanted to flag some examples close to home that we are considering in our national research. And I'll hand it back to you, Matilda.
Thanks. So now to talk about offshore wind, we've broken it up into 3 different categories of infrastructure so that we can compare and contrast between them, since we're seeing some interesting differences. So for offshore wind projects themselves, we found 6 examples, and these have had things like host community payments, community benefit funds, upgrades to grid infrastructure, ratepayer relief for low-income residents, and expanded internet access for residents in the community. There have also been 2 very recent CBAs with tribes, which I think is important to note because prior to this year, we had not seen any of those. One is with the Santa Ynez Band of Chumash Indians in California, and that involves the establishment of an environmental research institute and commitments to collaborative project planning, including the tribe renaming the project. And then the second is between Vineyard Wind and the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe in Massachusetts, and that tribal benefit agreement has a community benefit fund within it. And so prior to kind of this year, our key takeaway for this category of infrastructure was that it was pretty uncommon to see this form of agreement, that it was really only with island communities that we were seeing these, and it wasn't really a lot of financial commitment. But I would say that's changed recently with those 2 tribal benefit agreements. And so we'll kind of be watching this to see how this continues to change for CBAs for the projects themselves. For cable landings, so where the transmission infrastructure from a project comes on shore, typically at a beach in a coastal or island community, we've seen 5 agreements with several more that are kind of in the process of being negotiated. And these have had really big financial commitments. They've had host community payments ranging from 16 to 170 million. And the other provisions are typically pretty minimal. Sometimes they'll have construction plans set up to minimize local impacts and things like that. But it's typically just a really big financial commitment for these types of infrastructure. And then for offshore wind ports, we have found 3 finalized agreements, including one that was just announced last month or the month before. And there's some more in progress. And these have had provisions like host community payments to governments, schools and other entities, investments in local workforce training and business development, commitments to local and diverse hiring, establishing a climate adaptation fund, establishing an offshore wind education center, and making the port low emissions. The key takeaway here is that many of the benefits for port communities are likely to be related to education, training, and hiring for this new industry. There will often be some other financial benefits as well, but a lot of it really has to do with increasing opportunities for local residents to join the industry. And I will hand it back to Suzanne to talk about her experience with Monhegan Island.
Yeah, so it's great that we have an example here in the offshore wind side of things. If folks don't track the offshore wind industry very closely, just because of the technology that's going to be used in the Gulf of Maine, with the waters being deeper, the floating wind technology industry is taking a little bit longer to get developed. And so while we've seen discussions going on around community benefits, particularly to our south on the East Coast here for quite some time, we don't have as much activity here in the Gulf of Maine around offshore wind, with the exception of this earlier example. Sorry, there are other examples that's happening right now, but this was something that's been going on for quite some time off of Monhegan Island. And I know we do have folks online here today who were intimately involved in this process. So if we get questions, we'll have to see if they can join us in that discussion. But we do have a great example here where the community really came together to form an initiative called the Monhegan Energy Task Force that really tried to help guide the community's process to better understand the proposal for a project off of its shores, use the help of a facilitator to help the community have conversations, get the information that it needed around understanding the proposal. And then the community actually decided to establish a formal community benefits advisory committee, which they referred to as CBAC, to really help the community roll up its sleeves and understand what type of a community benefits package could be a good fit for them. With the developer sort of providing sort of some options and having some discussion around what that could look like, CBAC was actually able to bring on legal counsel with experience in land-based wind CBAs and other technical experts to help evaluate the proposals, to understand their options, and continue to have some great community facilitation to help better understand the potential for impact and the potential for benefits. The community then took a vote on 2 different options to consider in terms of a benefits package or options, and one of those passed unanimously. The result was a set of agreements. You can actually find this online, and spells out investments in community identified priorities that the community had gone through a process to sort of identify areas where they were looking for additional investment. And part of that included on-island infrastructure, including expanding broadband access and some of the on-island energy systems. So you've got a photo here of a tower going up on the island pretty recently. I think they're ready to make that project go live in the next couple of months. That was some of the funds through this benefit agreement actually were provided as matching funds for a federal grant to help make this project possible. So just a good example there. And I know there are folks that are working on this currently right now. Hannah MacDonald, give her a shout out, from Gulf of Maine Research Institute, is funded by the US Department of Energy to look into this topic of community benefits with coastal and fishing communities, and would flag her as a great resource on this topic as well. So we can go to the next slide, Matilda.
Thanks, Suzanne. So kind of leading out of that topic of the community lens to all of this, we're going to talk about some of the opinions we've heard from communities about community benefits. from our interviews and engagement with communities as part of this project. And we've learned that there's a lot of variation in how people are thinking about this topic. Communities may have a lot of different motivations for seeking benefits or choosing not to seek benefits. In some cases, it may be viewed as compensation in direct relation to negative impacts from a project. In other cases, it may have more to do with sharing the wealth from a project. And there's also other opinions in there as well. Another variation we've seen is that some view community benefits as inherently tied to equity, as in community benefits should only be given to disadvantaged communities, while others view it as more broadly applicable to all communities. We've also heard some think the process is driven by the developer, while others think communities are in control of the process. And finally, some think community benefits are something communities must have, while we've heard from two different communities on opposite sides of the country that big financial CBAs were not necessary or attractive to them in the context of all the other benefits wind energy had brought. We've learned that process really matters, but communities may have uncertainty about how to carry out the process and what their role is. For a long time, the only way that communities have learned about this topic was from looking at what other communities did, so peer exchange is a really valuable tool. And finally, we've heard that trust is a significant factor, whether that's distrust of developers' intentions, distrust of the local government receiving and distributing funds, or the importance of trusted leaders making decisions about benefits. So in terms of the process of how community benefits are established, we've seen that processes can vary widely depending on factors like the community context, like its history, internal dynamics, and access to financial resources, the type of project or infrastructure, and the stakeholder who is providing the benefits. We're going to kind of generalize and just talk about offshore wind as one bucket and land-based wind as another, because we've seen some similarities in the processes for these different types of infrastructure. For offshore wind, we've seen pretty extensive discussions between developers and representatives of impacted communities, coordination and collaboration between multiple community groups and governments within one community or area. We've seen that when communities have adequate resources, they might seek out facilitators, lawyers, or other forms of expertise, and that processes might be initiated by communities or by the developer, depending on the situation. For land-based wind, on the other hand, community benefits have not been used in a uniform manner by wind energy developers, and it's typically less publicized, making the process a little bit more difficult to generalize. But we've seen there are generally fewer official discussions between the developer and the community. The developer makes most decisions about benefits, though the community may be involved to some degree, such as serving on a committee that determines where funds from a community benefit fund are directed. And so one of the big reasons that community benefits are of rising importance in the wind energy industry is that there's a kind of perception that they may make projects easier to get built or more successful. But there's still a lot of uncertainty about that. Research in the US context on this topic is pretty limited, which makes sense given that community benefits are not required or common generally here. So we've needed to look to the UK and Ireland, where there are more standardized benefit schemes in place. And research in that context has found that the role of community benefits in social acceptance of wind projects is still pretty uncertain. There's a risk that communities will perceive benefits as a bribe from developers to buy their support. And some of the influential factors shaping how benefits are perceived include the structure and contents of the benefits, who's involved in decision-making, who's receiving the benefits. For example, one study found that if people who were against the project receive benefits, that may be perceived poorly by other community members, and then the timing. So if benefits are offered after the community has already voiced their opposition, it may be more likely to be perceived as a bribe to buy their support. Less has come out of this research about the process of making decisions about benefits, which is one reason we were interested in diving deeper into that topic in our research. And on the side here, I have some recent examples of projects that have had significant community benefits attached to them and still failed to gain public support. That is certainly not always the case, but I think it's instructive to think about these examples. So the first is the proposed land-based wind project, Fountain Wind in Northern California. It's undergoing several lawsuits related to community opposition, despite having a great deal of financial and non-financial benefits attached to it, including some kind of locally specific priorities like wildfire prevention. The second is Castle Wind, which was a proposed offshore wind project off the central coast of California, in which the developers formed multiple CBAs with the town and fishermen, but they did not win a lease in the BOEM lease auction. And then the third is some news from a city in Maryland, which was being considered for a cable landing site, or I guess still is being considered for a US wind and offshore wind project. But the community has really rejected the offer of financial compensation from the developer, stating that the community cannot be bought. Then there's the question of whether benefits should be proportional to the level and type of impact communities are seeing. So traditionally, there's been an idea that whatever compensation developers offer to communities is meant to be proportional to the impact that communities are going to see. because some impacts, like visual impacts, are just going to be unavoidable and you can only compensate for them as opposed to avoiding or minimizing them. But what caused this into question is that we're seeing offshore wind have much larger financial commitments and CBAs than land-based wind really ever has. Also much more than oil and gas and other offshore industries and onshore industries. And we're seeing these unprecedented dollar amounts that may be out of step with the level and type of impact. For example, communities being offered hundreds of millions of dollars for cables passing underground. And last year, a community on Long Island was offered a community benefit package of around $250 million in exchange for siting a cable landing, and they turned it down, rejecting the cable landing and the money offered. Earlier in the process, the community had stated that they felt they were entitled to be compensated for the impacts and that they were seeing this as a huge opportunity to get investment in their community, and yet they still turned that money down and turned the cable landing down. So if we're starting to see that things are out of proportion with the level and type of impact, we're curious about what's driving what communities are being offered or able to negotiate. And so this kind of brings us to the question of equity and energy justice, which is a really important question, but we don't yet have a clear-cut answer about the relationship here. One of the main tenets of energy justice is distributive justice, which refers to the idea of equitably sharing benefits and burdens from energy systems. And community benefits are a clear way to share the wealth from an energy project with the host community. They're also a way to share benefits across the community, so it's not just landowners with turbines benefiting, like with landowner payments. And some would say the equity element hinges on the type of process and how communities are able to be involved in developing community benefits, which relates to procedural justice. Additionally, some community benefits may be structured so that benefits specifically flow to disadvantaged community members as a way to support equity, like ratepayer relief for low-income community members or workforce training targeted at specific members of the community. On the other hand, community benefits can also reinforce inequities. Decision-making processes may not be carried out with equitable participation from the community or from diverse representatives of the community. Wealthier communities may be more able to advocate for themselves and have resources like time, money, and expertise that help them get a good benefits package. They may also present a more significant barrier of opposition for the same reasons, leading developers to take them more seriously and be more willing to provide them with benefits. And one trend that we're seeing is that communities with cable landing sites are receiving significantly more financial benefits than communities with ports, which are frequently lower income environmental justice communities. And these headlines on the side just are one example of that. For the same offshore project, South Fork Wind off of Long Island, the same developer offered a package of $30 million to the wealthy town hosting the cable landing, offered only $7 million to the community hosting the port, and that came after a prolonged period of advocacy and conflict led by the mayor of that city really advocating for the community to get anything since there were kind of no plans in place for any kind of compensation. And so all of this comes together to form key takeaways we have from our first years of research on this topic. The first being that community benefits have not been used in any kind of standard or typical way for either land-based or offshore wind, making it difficult to generalize and leading to a wide array of perceptions of what community benefits are and what they're supposed to do. We're starting to see some federal and state governments incentivize community benefits, and there are discussions about making community benefits required and more standardized. So there's the possibility that they will become more standard or typical in the future, but for now, definitely not the case. Community benefits have complicated relationships with key outcomes like local acceptance or approval, project outcomes, and equity. We don't exactly know whether they could be considered to generally work in support of those outcomes, but lots of folks, including our team, are working to better understand the impacts of community benefits so that we can be more informed going forward. And finally, community benefits are of growing importance to many developers, governments, and communities. This is not limited to just wind energy. Community benefits are being used across all renewable energy technologies and also around the world, as we've discussed in this presentation. So there's lots of different ways of viewing this topic and perspectives to consider. And so NREL will be continuing to work on this topic in a few different ways. The multi-year research project that we're engaged in involves collecting data on all land-based and offshore wind projects in the country to help kind of identify trends in geography, community characteristics, and project characteristics. And then after that, we'll be kind of launching a second phase of the study to work on linking the provision of community benefits to those key outcomes: social acceptance, project success or failure, and equity. We're also working this year to create a searchable online database that has all of the community benefit examples we've found. And this will have lots of details about the benefits and the projects they're attached to, as well as physical copies of agreements when we're able to find them. So keep your eyes out for that soon on the Department of Energy's Wind Exchange website. And I know Suzanne is going to talk about this a little bit more, so I'll just skip this last bullet and hand it off to her.
Thanks, Matilda. The last thing that we're working in terms of forwarding this topic is actually creating more space for discussion, learning, and potentially coordination and collaboration on this topic. So our team is leading a wind energy equity community of practice that's seeking to dig into the community benefit piece of that puzzle for our first year of convening. And so we are about to kick off our first community of practice meeting. It'll be primarily virtual, but we'll be looking for opportunities to add on to in-person events. So if you're interested in that, you are able to navigate this QR code on your screen. We'd love to get your expression of interest to get on an email list for this. We also can make sure that MCV has a link for you to be able to follow up with us to let us know if you're interested in it. The goals of this are really to sort of further explore the concepts of wind energy equity. And like I said, for the first year, dig into this community benefits topic together, kind of share what different actors are doing. We're really looking for sort of a cross-sector conversation. So researchers, folks from industry, government, and folks working more at the local level to be a part of this discussion. So what is everybody doing? What is everybody learning? Can we test out new ideas and assumptions or questions with each other? And importantly, from our perspective, identifying gaps where additional research or engagement is needed to be able to address these issues. So welcome you to let us know if you're interested to attend something like that. And if anybody's in the offshore wind space attending the IPF conference next week, Matilda is actually going to have a meetup on this topic of offshore wind community benefits and sort of connect into this community of practice. Our last slide is recognizing that we've thrown just so much information at you in this little bit of time. My understanding is MCV is recording and we'll make these slides available, so you can definitely follow up on all of this. But if you're really interested in the community benefits topic, suggest that you check out the guide that we published on the Wind Exchange site here that I put the link to in the chat. There's a lot of good examples in there. Put in a plug for the Wind Exchange site in general. There's a lot of information in there to help you better understand wind energy potential impacts and benefits. And there's also a chance to sign up for a number of newsletters through Wind Exchange. So that will help you to stay up to date with the new publications that we're adding, the webinar series. Matilda, in her other hats, is about to publish a community guide, an offshore wind community guide, a pretty comprehensive curated set of resources around offshore wind that is hopefully pulling from the National Lab research, but accessible to folks working on the ground on that topic. So certainly would encourage folks to add your name to the list. You can be aware of our upcoming research. Last thing I just wanted to do is that particularly in the offshore wind space, we have been doing some Maine specific research. So if you're interested in that technology in particular, I encourage you to check out this report that's down in the bottom right-hand corner that we put together last year. It's a pretty comprehensive overview, a sort of techno-economic and social look at the opportunities and challenges of offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine. And for those of you particularly interested in the fisheries side of things, we're really excited to be working with a team of researchers here at NREL to really look at alternative designs for offshore wind turbines so that they minimize the impact to fishing activity. So hope folks might find those resources useful. And I think we can probably hand it back over to you, Kathleen and Maggie.
Oh my goodness. What an incredible amount of information. I know I have a feeling that I am going to be watching the recording myself, even though I've been here live, because there's just so much to learn. And I really appreciate you walking us through this introduction. Matilda and Suzanne, just incredible work. Just so everybody knows, we will share the recording. We'll share all of those good links. And there are a bunch of community benefits agreements, webinars, and resources coming up for good reason. This is very exciting and a very key part of renewable energy development. So we'll send you all sorts of things, and we will dive into questions right now. I'm sure we will all have more questions at the end of this hour, but I also know that we're going to have lots of opportunities to continue learning together. So thanks for being in this with us. I think we'll just dive straight in and say who or what defines a host community? How do I know if I'm in one?
Matilda, you want to take that one?
Sure, I can start off and then I think you'll probably have some useful insights as well. That is a really good question. I think sometimes that is something that gets decided more by the developer than by the community, which is probably not the right approach, but they have to decide. Often the reason for offering benefits, to be frank, is that they're trying to get their project built, and so they might need a local approval from some part of the community, whether that's siting or like, some kind of tax agreement they need passed, things like that. So it might be the county or the community, whoever has the jurisdictional authority over that land. It's the same reason they would offer a landowner payment to the landowner whose land they're trying to lease for a turbine, as opposed to, every landowner in the community. So that's one kind of cynical way of looking at it. The other, I would say, is that communities may have some amount of ability to define that for themselves. So if they're coming together in a collaborative process, they may choose to involve community members or groups that are outside of, their direct host community and share the benefits with them. We've certainly seen that. So that is my kind of overarching thought. And I feel like Suzanne also will have some good insights from her experience.
Yeah, I mean, again, different things to different people. Some entities have gone so far as to define this specifically. It's interesting, in New York, there's been a lot of discussion around linking benefits to disadvantaged communities, and they went through a very extensive process through which they decided on a definition of disadvantaged communities. They then went through a very extensive process to talk about what to basically decide what was an acceptable benefit to a disadvantaged community. So I think we're really seeing that's, I think for Matilda and I, we spent all of last year talking to people from across the country on this, and some people were sort of adamant, like, this is what it is. And I think what we found is that there's just tremendous variability. And I think, what is so interesting to me in the work that we're doing is that, step one was just wrap our arms around the different agreements that are out there. Everybody wants to see examples, right? And create the list. And I know a lot of people are working on that. But I think the sort of research and analysis that Matilda and the rest of our team will do is really trying to link all of this in a more concrete way to then inform some decisions that could be made by decision makers, policymakers, industry about what to do about this. So I know in Europe, for example, they've really moved to, in some instances, standardizing these benefits packages and, being really clear. And I think seeing that in some ways, to create a little bit of equity there in how benefits are allocated. The idea there, though, is, that's potentially challenging, is all communities are different. They have their own different experiences and histories and whatnot. So all of this just to say that moving towards standardization and shared understanding of key terms seems really important. But I think, as Matilda said, I think there's also this idea of having some flexibility around this is something that is sort of in this discussion as well.
Here I thought I was giving you a softball question to start, like, oh, this one will just knock right out. But thank you. I appreciate that, and it sounds, I'm hearing the beginnings of the answer, I think, to the next question, which is that this seems like a huge amount of work for a community to take on. Huge benefits, obviously, but how do we alleviate that burden, knowing that the communities that are most impacted are likely to, may have the least resources to engage in this process? Suzanne, you mentioned standardization of, like, are there templates that we can say, this is what we want? But maybe there's some other way to ease the process for communities. What have you seen?
Yeah, I mean, that procedural component for me personally was a huge driver to do this work, right? Not only do they mean different things to different people, they're created in very different ways. I think Matilda outlined well, and just watching the folks here in New England and the great efforts that they went to in very small resource constrained communities. Not only is it time consuming, it can be expensive. These are sometimes polarizing, challenging issues, right? And so there's sort of a lot to step up to for something that communities didn't necessarily raise their hands and ask for. But I hear the voice of somebody from Block Island who kind of made that comment at one point, sort of said, we didn't ask for this, but we tried to make the most of it, right? So there's opportunity in all of this as well. I think from our perspective with our researcher hat on, it is about trying to make this information more widely accessible as quickly as we can. And so as Matilda and I, found there's a lot of people entering this space right now, a huge number of efforts. And part of the role we're going to try to play, in addition to forwarding the research, is just the convening of everybody doing this work so we can do a better job of sharing resources. I had a great conversation with Hannah MacDonald at GMRI just ahead of this call around just, how can we more rapidly know on the coast of Maine what's happening, on the coast of California? How can we more rapidly share those examples? And again, until there is, in some instances, there are increasingly requirements in specific language and procurement, and it is getting more specific in some places. But until it's standardized, it still is sort of folks finding their own way through this. And so I think, sharing that information and research as rapidly as we can. And then I'd like to think around thinking creatively around partnerships. There's a great example in the Humboldt County region of Northern California, where Community Foundation has convened a group of many different types of stakeholders to really think at a collective approach across different community organizations, some of the tribes, to sort of say, what is it that we would like to prioritize in this process. They're really doing that sort of readiness, preparedness for this process, and bringing in some consultants. So, there you have an example of a foundation with some financial resources to bring to bear to support this community process. I saw one of the presenters from our webinar last month, Tristan, who I know is from the Black Economic Development Council in Massachusetts. He's doing some really great work down there in terms of bringing different stakeholders together to talk about this. So I think the opportunity for collaboration is really important as well. And then thinking creatively about asks for those resources. We have the example on Monhegan and Block Island, and where the developer is actually supporting the community to get some of this technical support, facilitation support to be able to do this. So I think that's a very long-winded answer to say that yes, it is true that it is currently a potentially challenging process if you have limited time and money and people, as is often the case these days. But I think, we're out here trying to find ways, at least from the NREL's perspective and DOE's perspective, to provide more resources and support on this moving forward.
Thank you. It is a lot, and I really appreciate knowing that you all have seen so much and really can help distill some of that. Matilda, you shared an example of a community negotiating a CBA with a developer who then ended up not getting the lease to actually build the project. And so there's some question about the order of operations here. When does a community decide who to engage with, or is it possible to sort of draw up your, what you're looking for and shop it around to different developers? Or, what should we take away from that story about when and how and who to work with in this process?
Yeah, that's a really great and interesting question. I would say in that case, the developer was trying to do everything right. Like, they had a conception, and it should have been correct conception, that they would be more successful in the lease auction if they had already taken those steps, because the leasing agency, BOEM, had pretty much said that. So it totally makes sense that they went ahead and were proactive in that way. It makes sense that the community, jumped at the opportunity to engage with them and be the recipient of that. So it's sort of just a situation where it's too bad that it didn't work out for either of them, like that both were trying to do the right thing. I think in that case, there's still a chance that another developer that was awarded a lease will pick up those agreements and kind of like just sign them themselves. So it may not be that all that effort was lost. But I think we're seeing the same thing with land-based wind. For example, Suzanne mentioned that with the Down East project, some of those grants they've been giving out since like 2020, 2021. So like long before it was certain that the project would be built. So in some cases, benefits may begin flowing early, which is nice for the community, because even if the project doesn't get built, they may still see some benefit. Of course, that's a risk for the developer, that they may be, kind of throwing money at something that it's not going to work in their favor. I don't know that I have some concept of whether it's right or wrong to do things early. I think both parties maybe have a reason for doing that. And it kind of points to like a more long-term relationship that the developer is committing to, as opposed to like, we'll pay you once this project's built and not a moment before. But it is a really interesting question, and I think it's probably something developers are wrangling with. I think most of them will probably not, commit to anything until they have a lease in place. So it was unusual in California that they were willing to do that before it was certain that they would be building a project. I don't know if Suzanne has additional thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, just that recognition of some invest, and I think there are other examples, Matilda, from some of the offshore wind folks we've talked to about making those investments sort of earlier before, because it can take 7, 8, 9, 10 years, for some of these projects, and out of recognition that communities are putting a lot into the process, and making those investments, and building that partnership is something that I think we're seeing, and that was part of that Monhegan example, and other places as well.
We have just a couple of minutes left, so I think I'll skip to this, the big question. Does this work? Do we see that communities realize the benefits that they're sort of promised through community benefits agreements, or are there are there examples of delays or of resources going places we didn't expect them to go? Is it all worth it?
Matilda, you start.
Yeah, I would say that the monitoring and tracking of impacts is an area we're behind in, both ourselves and the developers and the communities. Like, we haven't really spoken to anyone who's really like tracked impacts over time, and maybe we've just missed them. I'm sure there are some folks that are doing that. In terms of whether people actually follow through, that's part of the benefit of like a legally binding agreement, is that you can sue them if they don't. So that's why some communities are going that route, as opposed to like a fund or something where maybe there's not a legal mechanism attached to it. But I think there are a lot of success stories. Like, we've talked to communities that had really seen huge changes in their community because of a community benefit agreement, or commitments that were made, or donations that were made, things like that. So I would say there is a lot of precedent and evidence to show that it is a positive thing for communities. But in terms of whether it works for developers and projects, that's another question. So it's great that we're seeing them do it more and more. I would be worried that maybe if it's starting to seem like it's not worth it to them, that maybe that will go away a little bit, at least for land-based. I feel like for offshore, it probably is around here to stay. But those would be my initial thoughts.
Yeah, and I would just add, I mean, there's sort of different dimensions to your question for me, Kathleen. I think, is it worth it? What are the benefits? We had a lot of dialogue with folks around our sort of quote unquote definition that's guiding our research. There are so many other benefits to developing clean energy. And as Matilda said, we talked to people on to both sides of the country who were sort of like, we didn't feel the need to ask for an exorbitant amount of money because we feel like we're already benefiting, and these impacts were not that concerning to us. It's not, there's obviously a lot of nuance in each of those instances. I don't mean to minimize anything, but that is what we heard, right? So I think how you define benefit, there are these much broader benefits. And so we're talking more about these voluntary investments. And then I'll just say, yeah, we hosted a peer exchange session around offshore wind community benefits last summer. And it was very much like, okay, now we need to pivot to this concept of accountability reporting. How are we tracking this? Whereas everybody was just sort of saying, how do we set them up? And now it's sort of like, well, how do we know if it's actually working? And so there's been some good work happening out of Vineyard Wind around reports to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts around job creation. And I think they're taking that effort pretty seriously. But, there's a whole nother piece of work to be done if you want to actually set up and track and evaluate and report out on these impacts. And I think that's another area of research for all of us moving forward too.
Suzanne, Matilda, thank you so much for the work that you're doing and for your time and thoughtfulness in sharing that with us today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I have a feeling this is going to be a topic that we return to again and again. We'll share some opportunities for other programs on community benefits agreements. There are quite a few on the calendar coming up. And we also are working on our May Lunch and Learn schedule already. We haven't finalized that, but we've got programs about how businesses in Maine are getting involved in the climate action movement. And one that I think is going to be really exciting for many of the folks on this call, something called Permitting the Clean Energy Transition. So look for that email coming up with our May schedule. We will see you all soon, and thank you so much for your time and your energy and your investment in our communities. We will see you again.
Hey, Dan.